We are seeing bills that will roll back the historic ease of voting that we all experienced in 2021 and the protections that were enacted. The very laws that we enacted led to the historic turnout in November. The bills this year are nothing short of dangerous and show that there is a deep chasm between some of the polished words and speeches we have heard and some of the legislation. But words matter, Mr. Speaker. Dishonesty and misinformation continue to weaken and threaten our political system. We are hearing rumors of voter fraud, but I do not hear those same people questioning the results of their election that brought us a new administration and new House members.
That's facts. Hi, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. I'm Jason Johnson in for Nicole Wallace. That was Virginia Delegate Marcia Price last month exposing the pure ridiculousness of Republicans in her state. Republicans who won in Virginia's election this past November, where we saw Glenn Youngkin elected as governor and the GOP take back control of the state's House of Delegates. Yet now, the party who had so much success from the expansions of access to the ballot box is the same party taking steps to undo those measures. The Brennan Center for Justice out today with its latest tally of laws and proposed bills that limit voting access, and here's what they found. Quote, Virginia leads the nation in new proposed restrictive voting legislation so far in 2022, with 34 pre-filed or introduced bills. 21 of these bills would repeal provisions of current state law that ensure voter access to mail voting, including the permanent absentee voter list, drop boxes for the return of absentee ballots, and no excuse absentee voting. Just yesterday, we saw Virginia House Republicans block two measures, one of which would automatically restore voting rights to convicted felons following their sentences. The Virginia Mercury, an online news organization, called it, quote, a major setback for voting rights advocates who have spent years pushing to end Virginia's lifetime disenfranchisement policy for people convicted of felonies, which falls disproportionately on black communities. There we have it, the impact of these new measures, making it harder for minorities and people who tend to vote Democratic to cast their ballots. More from the Brennan Center's nationwide voting rights update. In keeping with restrictive voting laws passed last year, state legislators have resumed the assault with legislation that, if enacted, would disproportionately impact voters of color. They mean black people. The center's latest data shows a clear acceleration in efforts to suppress the vote. Quote, as of January 14th, legislators in at least 27 states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 250 bills with restrictive provisions compared to 75 such bills in 24 states a year before. When carryover bills are set aside to focus on new legislative activity, the increase in restrictive bills is still stark. 96 bills would make it harder to vote in 12 states as of January 14, 2022, compared to 69 such bills in 23 states, a 39% increase. The unending fight to protect the right to vote is where we start this hour. Elie Mystal is the justice correspondent for The Nation, the Lewis Black of politics, one of my favorite people. Dr. Christina Greer, author, political science professor at Fordham University and politics editor at The Grio, and Virginia Delegate Marcia Price from the Hampton area, which is where I was born. Thank you for coming on the show today. Delegate Price, I'm going to start with you. What the heck is happening? Just tell us what it has been like in Virginia, which has been a purple, blue trending state for the last couple of years. You have Glenn Youngkin get into office claiming that he's the nice basketball playing suburban kind of clickbait on Netflix. I'm a suburban guy. I'm not a harsh Republican. And then we see this flood of bills. What has it been like in the legislature to see this kind of change?
Yeah, I think the new motto that we have is it's disappointing but not surprising when all of the progress that we're seeing is they're trying to roll it back. But you're exactly right. What I said on the floor is absolutely true. They're giving speeches on this and let's have, unity and diversity. But the legislation that they are putting forward does anything but, and it actually repeals everything that led to the historic turnout on both sides in the 2021 election. But what we're also seeing is the stone wall that we have, the brick wall in the Senate Democrats that with the slimmest of majorities still do have that majority, and they are killing those bills in the Privileges and Elections Committee. But for that slim majority, we would be Texas and Georgia as well.
Speaking of Stonewall, from the Hill newspaper, we have new information that Virginia lawmakers have struck down same-sex marriage, voting rights proposals, and, quote, from an ABC affiliate in Richmond, despite high Democratic turnout, Youngkin outperformed Trump in every locality in Virginia on his way to victory. More votes were cast in this year's Virginia governor's race, last year's Virginia governor's race, than in any other gubernatorial election in the state's history. Nearly 3.3 million of Virginia's 5.5 million registered voters cast a ballot for the governor, the highest turnout percentage the Commonwealth has seen since the governor's race in '93. Dr. Greer, I'll start with you. These high turnout numbers were due to the fact that lots of people had access to the ballot. Why would the Republicans be so dedicated to overturning the very laws that allow them to achieve a victory in a state that had been trending against them for the last 20 years?
Right. I mean, it seems counterintuitive, Jason, but we know that Republicans have been playing a long-term strategy. And so they're more than happy to cut off voting rights because they think, and in certain places they know, will disproportionately affect voters of color who, by and large, tend to vote for the Democratic Party. And so they also are hoping that when they get power, they can take away so many rights and privileges of Democratic voters, read voters of color, that they'll essentially remove them from the political process for years to come. And so, as Delegate Price so succinctly put, I mean, in many ways, Governor Youngkin is worse than Donald Trump because he does what the president wanted to do, but he does it in a legislative way, and he does it with a fleece vest on, which makes a lot of Republicans who didn't want to necessarily cast themselves with a blatant white supremacist and white nationalists, but they can do so feeling better about themselves for supporting Governor Youngkin and these draconian and regressive policies and politics that he's practicing in the state of Virginia.
So what you're telling me is that in order to not look racist, all you need is a plaid shirt and a Patagonia vest. Thank you. This is helpful campaign information we need to know.
It's a fleece, Jason. That's the new uniform and the. And by the way, don't think I missed. I'm one of your favorite people too. By the way.
Most definitely, Dr. Greer. Most definitely. Ellie, the Republicans are making the same argument in Virginia that they make around the country, which is this is about election integrity. This is about making sure the votes aren't stolen. But their own reports have shown that you didn't have any massive voter fraud. You didn't have any issues with ballots being stolen. You didn't have any issues with people running into senior citizen homes and changing their registrations from Republican to Democrat. Who do you think they're making this argument for at this point? Because it's not based on facts, and their voters would vote for them regardless.
It's for white people. It's so white people can feel a little bit more comfortable with the racism that they are tacitly or sometimes explicitly supporting. The Republicans aren't making the same arguments. The Republicans are making the same arguments that like John C. Calhoun made and Jefferson Davis made. White people seem to think that you need to be willing to murder a freedom rider in order to be racist against black people voting. You don't. All you have to do is be unwilling to enforce the 15th Amendment. There is one constitutional provision that saves this country from the apartheid state that it was founded upon. And that is the 15th Amendment that grants suffrage regardless of race. And then eventually the 19th Amendment, which grants suffrage regardless of sex. And then eventually, after those two kind of came together, sometime later, black women also were included in suffrage in this country. If you don't support those two amendments, then you don't support equality, period. And right now, white people, white Republicans do not support and will not enforce those two amendments. And that's why we are where we are.
Delegate Price, I'm curious about this. One of the concerns that people have after they had last year's election is concerns about gerrymandering, concerns about affecting the state population, moving ballot boxes, et cetera, et cetera. What is the status of Virginia in those areas now? Are you concerned? I mean, obviously, we're concerned about ballot boxes being moved, but are there any notable debates or fights or legal arguments right now about how the districts in that state have been cut up? And is that a concern heading forward?
Yeah, so we unfortunately passed a constitutional amendment last year. So there was a commission that was called bipartisan, but it was deadlocked. And so the decision of the commission actually ended up going to the Virginia Supreme Court, where special masters drew the maps. And they actually drew the maps toward partisan equity and instead of reflecting the actual blueness of the state and the trends toward the state. So there's that. And then on the legislative front, there are bills that will pass the House tomorrow that are up for vote tomorrow that roll back a lot of those measures that you saw that made it easier to vote in Virginia. We went from the 38th state to the 12th state because of the things that we were putting in place, and drop boxes are there. So I think it's really important, just as was said, to see not just individual bills, not just to talk about photo ID and whether or not it's easier not to get, but to look at all of this as part of a national strategic playbook that Virginia Republicans are not refusing to be a part of. They're completely bought in on trying this. And so it's really important that when people talk about what's happening across the nation, that they include Virginia in, unfortunately, some of those trends.
And again, it's amazing to see all of this, despite the fact that the Republicans won. They still want to engage in these sorts of behaviors. It may not be the best way, but that's all they know. I want to go to the Washington Post. I want to take this to you, Ellie, in a recent piece that you wrote in The Nation. You talked about the fact that the redistricting that we saw in the state of Alabama has been absolutely ridiculous, absolutely repressive. The Supreme Court pretty much backed it. I want to quote you here and then have you sort of give us the full detail. I cannot name a map 2 races for the conservatives on the Supreme Court, because it has effectively said it will do nothing to stop any maps, no matter how racist they might be. I cannot name a voter suppression tactic 2 races for conservatives, because they just determined that we are too close to an election for anything to be done. This is not like Jim Crow. This is what the courts in the Jim Crow era did. Ellie, when we see what happened in Alabama, and for people to understand, the districts that they crammed together are absolutely ridiculous. What hope is there across the country to battle the kind of gerrymandering that we're seeing by Republicans?
If we are in the penumbra of the 2022 election, which is what Brett Kavanaugh argued that we were yesterday, then there is no hope, right? Because if we're too, and remember, these are the same people who put Amy Coney Barrett on the court after the election to replace the person who appointed her started. But now, if we're too close to an election to stop racism from happening in our voting booths, then I don't know how to stop it, right? Understand, Alabama put forth its racist redistricting map on October 25th, 2021, after the 2020 census. They were sued by November 15th, 2021. So they were sued as fast as possible. And they lost as fast as possible. But then the Supreme Court reinstated the racist maps, saying that they were too close to the election. Folks, that's a wrap. Like, if we're now too close to the election to overturn racist laws because it would confuse people before 2022, what the court is essentially saying is that every state, not just Alabama, every state gets one midterm election that's as racist as possible for free before the court will even look to see if the 15th Amendment should be applied against them. That when I say this is Jim Crow, again, people need to understand, all the Jim Crow era Supreme Court did was pretend the 15th Amendment didn't exist, was just put some white out over that amendment that we fought a war over. The court doesn't have to invent new racist strategies. The states are more than capable of figuring it out themselves. We're just talking about Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi. They can figure that out for themselves. So the court doesn't have to show them the way. They have to allow them to walk the path. And that's what this Supreme Court is doing, just like the Plessy v. Ferguson court, just like the Dred Scott court. It's the same court that just happens again and again throughout history, and we are now living with it once more.
Dr. Greer, I am occasionally accused of being a pessimist or a cynic, so I'm turning to you. I mean, just from a campaign strategy standpoint, what are the chances for African-American candidates, Democratic candidates this fall, if this is now, as Ellie is pointing out, the law of the land? I know you've got people organizing in Alabama. I know you've got people organizing for Val Demings in Florida. I know you've got people organizing in Wisconsin and for Stacey Abrams and Warnock in Georgia. Is there a strategic way to battle the kind of gerrymandering and voter suppression that we're seeing become the law of the land?
Not in the institutional sense that was laid out. I don't think that that's necessarily, just doing business as usual. We should just have turnout. What I've always said, Jason, is that white people need to speak to their relatives. And so if you are a Democrat and you are patting yourself on the back for voting for Obama twice and you would have voted for him a third time, or you love Stacey Abrams and Reverend Warnock, it's not enough to just say, but everyone else in my family voted for X, or everyone else in my family voted for Youngkin. You need to sit your family members down and explain to them the threat that the Republican Party faces to American democracy. It's not even about just supporting the Democratic Party blindly. Walk them through the white nationalist road we are on with this particular party. Walk them through the inability for Republicans to see any bipartisanship. We are in deadlock when it comes to understanding small d democratic principles. So, at a certain point in time, the Chrissies and the Ellies and the Jasons and the Delegate Prices of the world can't articulate enough to people. It has to be white people talking to their Republican relatives to explain to them the threat that we face. Because even if it's not in your state today, as Delegate Price laid out, this is not just about southern states. This is a multi-pronged 50-state strategy for Republicans that they've been working on, and they'll continue to work on until they take our ovaries, our voting rights, our clean air and drinking water, and you name it. And they'll do it in just a fashion that we see that they're more than willing to take this entire country off of a financial cliff, an environmental cliff, a civil rights cliff, you name it. And it's not individual anymore. People have to sort of put on their own bootstraps and talk to their own family members.
Ain't nobody inviting me over for dinner.
Right. and not one of these legislators will be accused of being racist unless they, openly kill a civil rights activist in broad daylight. I want to bring this back actually to the concerns that legislators have brought forward. What we have here, there was a letter from over 40 Congressional Black Caucus members to AG Merrick Garland, led by Ayanna Pressley, Jim Clyburn, Mondaire Jones, and they said, while we applaud the litigation that you have filed in some jurisdictions, we encourage and expect you to exponentially increase your efforts to challenge unlawful and unconstitutional voter suppression wherever it occurs. Our message is simple. Be creative, be relentless, be unapologetic in your commitment to do whatever it takes to ensure that every American has their vote counted, no matter how they look or where they live. No lawsuit is too trivial when it comes to the voting rights of citizens. Delegate Price, the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus has to do this during Black History Month to AG Merrick Garland sort of demonstrates the sort of bind that many legislators, African-American legislators, are in. From your perspective, who have you been able to, or you and fellow African-American legislators in Virginia, have you tried to make trips to Washington, D.C.? Have you talked to states' attorneys? Who are the people that you have been able to go to and say, hey, this situation is dire, or have you run into the same difficulties that the CBC has run into with Merrick Garland?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are running into those same difficulties. But one thing that we did do, and why elections do matter, in 2021, we passed one of my bills, which was the Voting Rights Act of Virginia. And we did that because we knew we could not trust the federal level, unfortunately, even those that say that they stand for voting rights, because we weren't seeing across the board, across history, we weren't seeing people step up in the ways that we needed to. So there are some protections that we still have in Virginia because of that Voting Rights Act on the state level. But we echo the calls. We're in session right now, so we can't get to DC, but have been calling and just making sure that people understand that even those states, those like Virginia that were called progressive last year, we're in the same exact place that we need to be beside our brothers and sisters in Texas and Georgia and so many other states. We need help on the federal level, and we need it now. And that's from all three branches of government. And if we can't, shall I say, I know I get in trouble for saying it, but if we can't depend on those that say that they're with us, then don't come asking us for things when it comes to other issues. Everyone is talking about all of these other issues. Voting rights are fundamental and foundational to anything else that we are talking about within our legislatures. We would not be able to fight for minimum wage raises. We're not going to be able to fight for the environment or any of these other issues if we lose the right to vote and access to democracy within our communities that we're fighting for. And so, yes, step up. Please do your job, because all of us are depending upon that.
Elie Mystal, Dr. Christina Greer, and Virginia Delegate Marcia Price, thank you so much for starting us off this hour.